At exactly 6:18 on a freezing Chicago morning, billionaire Nathaniel Brooks climbed the staircase with his usual cup of black coffee, expecting to find every room in his mansion untouched. Instead, he stopped dead outside a door that had remained closed for 23 years. The coffee slipped from his hand and shattered across the marble floor. Inside, poor maid Clara Warren wasn't sleeping in the mansion's grand master suite. She had chosen the one room no one had entered since his sister died, and what she had quietly done there overnight left him unable to speak. He had handed her a set of keys for one night. Somehow she had unlocked far more than a door. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. I'd love to see how far this story travels. And if heartfelt stories about kindness, dignity, and second chances mean something to you, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next journey. Long before Clara Warren ever held the brass keys to a billionaire's mansion, her mornings began in a very different place. At 4:45 every weekday, before Chicago's skyline had even begun to glow, the alarm on her 12-year-old phone buzzed softly on the milk crate that served as her bedside table. She always silenced it before it rang a second time. Not because she feared oversleeping. She hadn't slept deeply in years. The apartment was barely 600 square feet, tucked into the second floor of an aging brick building on the south side. The radiator clanged unpredictably through the winter. The kitchen faucet leaked one drop every few seconds, and the windows rattled whenever the wind swept across Lake Michigan. The landlord had promised to replace them 3 winters ago. He never did. Clara swung her feet onto the worn wooden floor, pulled on thick wool socks, and wrapped a faded gray cardigan around her shoulders. The apartment was cold enough that she could see her breath for the first few minutes every morning. She never complained. Instead, she walked quietly to the kitchen and reached for the small blue kettle she had owned since Ethan was 7. Its handle had been repaired twice with black electrical tape. The kettle whistled exactly 4 minutes later, every morning, without fail. While oatmeal simmered in a dented saucepan, Clara packed lunch into the same stainless steel container she had carried for nearly 9 years. Half a turkey sandwich, an apple, a handful of baby carrots. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted. On the refrigerator door hung a handwritten note in blue ink. "Leave every place a little better than you found it." She read it every morning. She had written it herself years earlier, not because she needed reminding, because she wanted Ethan to grow up seeing those words before he saw anything else. At exactly 5:08, another bedroom door opened. "Morning, Mom." Ethan Warren stood rubbing sleep from his eyes, taller than she remembered every single week. 16 years old, lean, quiet, gentle. He had inherited Clara's patient smile and his father's calm eyes. "You should have slept another 10 minutes, Clara said. "You say that every morning. And every morning you're still awake." He laughed softly. "I guess neither of us is very good at listening." She handed him a bowl of oatmeal. He sprinkled exactly 1 spoonful of cinnamon across the top. Always 1, never 2. It had become another one of those tiny rituals that belonged only to the 2 of them. While they ate, the television remained off. Phones stayed in their pockets. The apartment was filled only with the sounds of spoons tapping ceramic bowls and the distant rumble of trains beginning their morning routes. "So," Ethan finally asked, "you still working at the Brooks mansion today?" Clara nodded. "The cleaning company got another week there. That's the billionaire's place, right?" "That's what everyone says." "You ever seen him?" "Only once." "What was he like?" She thought for a moment before answering. "Lonely." Ethan looked surprised. "I didn't ask if he was lonely." "I know." She smiled gently. "But that's what I noticed." After breakfast, Ethan slipped on his backpack before grabbing a grease-stained jacket from the hook beside the front door. He attended high school until 3 in the afternoon. Then he spent 4 hours helping at a neighborhood auto repair garage. The extra money paid for groceries. He never complained either. Before leaving, he stopped beside the refrigerator and read the handwritten note one more time. "Leave every place a little better." "Then you found it," Clara finished. Their eyes met. Neither of them realized how much those words would soon matter. Outside, the January air cut through every layer of clothing. Snow from the previous evening still covered the sidewalks in uneven patches. Clara walked 4 blocks to the first bus stop carrying only 3 things: her lunch container, a faded brown canvas bag, and a black leather sketchbook with worn corners. Most people assumed it was the journal. It wasn't. Inside were nearly 200 hand-drawn interior designs: coffee shops, libraries, bedrooms, reading corners, community centers, children's classrooms. Every page had been drawn by Clara during lunch breaks, bus rides, or quiet evenings after Ethan had gone to sleep. Years ago, she had spent 2 semesters studying interior design at Harold Washington College. Her professors had believed she had talent. One had even written on the corner of an assignment, "You don't decorate rooms, you understand how people breathe inside them." Then life changed. Her husband, Marcus Warren, was diagnosed with aggressive lymphoma. Tuition stopped. Medical bills began. Clara sold her drafting tools first, then her laptop, then her textbooks. Finally, she withdrew from college. She promised herself she'd return one day. Marcus died 8 months later. College never happened again, but the sketchbook remained. It became the one thing she refused to sell. The first bus arrived at 5:42, the second at 6:09, the third just after sunrise. Nearly 90 minutes passed before Clara finally reached the northern edge of Chicago, where tree-lined streets widened and old stone mansions overlooked the frozen lake. Every morning the contrast felt unreal. One neighborhood measured wealth by lakefront property. The other measured survival by whether the heating still worked. Clara never envied either. She simply stepped off the bus, adjusted the strap of her canvas bag, and continued walking. The Brooks estate occupied nearly an entire city block. Iron gates, stone fountains now frozen solid, towering oak trees wrapped in snow. Even after cleaning there for almost 2 weeks, Clara still slowed down each morning before entering. Not because the mansion intimidated her, because it reminded her how different lives could become. Inside the employee entrance, Margaret Ellis was already checking names off a clipboard. She looked up as Clara arrived. "You're 2 minutes early." "I know." "I don't think I've ever seen you late." "I don't like making other people wait." Margaret smiled, despite herself. She had managed housekeeping teams for nearly 20 years. She had seen employees steal silverware, fake injuries disappear during shifts, and argue over 15-minute breaks. Clara had done none of those things. Ever. "Third floor today," Margaret said. "The East Guest Wing." "Anything special?" "Just remember the rules. No photographs. No personal conversations with the owner. No entering restricted hallways." Clara nodded. "I remember." Margaret hesitated before lowering her voice. "And if you see Mr. Brooks?" "Yes." "Don't expect much?" Clara tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "He notices everything." "That sounds normal. But he almost never says anything." Margaret looked toward the grand staircase before continuing. "I've worked here 6 years. I've never seen him smile." For a brief moment, Clara thought back to Ethan's question that morning. What was he like? She still believed her answer had been correct. Lonely, not cruel, not arrogant, simply lonely. She clipped her employee badge onto her uniform, picked up her cleaning cart, and pushed it slowly across polished marble floors that reflected the pale winter light streaming through towering windows. The mansion was silent, beautiful, perfect, yet somehow emptier than the little apartment she had left only 2 hours earlier. Clara didn't know it yet. Before the next sunset, a single unexpected act of kindness would place the oldest brass key in Nathaniel Brooks's hand, and the quiet promise written on her refrigerator would lead her toward the one room no one else had dared to enter for 23 years. By 6:15 every morning, Nathaniel Brooks stood in exactly the same place. The eastern window of his study overlooked the frozen waters of Lake Michigan, where winter transformed the shoreline into a landscape of silver and blue. From there, he could watch the first sunlight spill across the snow-covered gardens, long before the rest of the household came to life. He never needed an alarm. His body had learned the rhythm decades ago. Wake at 5:30. Read the financial reports delivered overnight. Drink 1 cup of black coffee without sugar. Walk through the West Gallery. Return to the study. Begin work before 7. It was a routine so precise that even the household staff adjusted their schedules around it. Order had become his way of surviving. Chaos had already taken too much. The Brooks estate had once been known as one of Chicago's warmest homes. 32 rooms stretched across 3 floors of limestone and oak, but guests had always remembered something other than its size. Music, laughter, fresh flowers in every hallway, the smell of cinnamon bread drifting from the kitchen every Sunday morning. Those memories belonged to another lifetime. Now the mansion felt almost museum-like. Every chair sat perfectly aligned. Every painting hung exactly level. Fresh lilies appeared each Monday in crystal vases, though no one ever stopped to admire them. Fireplaces burned only because the maintenance schedule required them to. The house remained immaculate, but it no longer felt lived in. Nathaniel often walked through entire wings without hearing another human voice. He preferred it that way, or at least he had convinced himself he did. At precisely 6:15, Eleanor Hayes entered carrying a polished silver tray. She had served as Nathaniel's executive house manager for nearly 18 years. Unlike the rotating cleaning staff, Eleanor knew the invisible rules that governed the estate. She placed the coffee beside him without speaking. 1 cup. Always the same dark roast from a small, family-owned roastery in Wisconsin. Always brewed for exactly 5 minutes. Nathaniel nodded once. That was enough. After a moment, Eleanor cleared her throat. The contractors called again. Nathaniel didn't look up from the reports spread across his desk. About what? The East Corridor. Silence. They're asking whether you still want it sealed before spring renovations. I said no. They're concerned about the heating system. I said no. Eleanor waited another second. The humidity is beginning to affect. 19 years, Nathaniel interrupted quietly. They've managed for 19 years. I believe they can manage another. Eleanor lowered her eyes. Yes, sir. She left without another word. Nathaniel stared through the window, but he no longer saw the lake. His thoughts had drifted elsewhere. Toward the eastern wing. Toward a hallway that every employee was instructed never to enter. Toward a single brass key that never left his pocket. He reached inside his navy wool cardigan and wrapped his fingers around it almost unconsciously. The metal felt colder than the air outside. Old, smooth from decades of use. The key had once opened a room filled with laughter. Now it guarded silence. He closed his hand around it until his knuckles turned pale. Then he slipped it back into his pocket before anyone could notice. Across the mansion, Clara had already begun her morning assignment. Her cleaning cart rolled quietly over polished hardwood floors. She always worked from left to right. Top shelves first, windows second, furniture last. The order never changed. Margaret had once joked that Clara cleaned rooms the way musicians played sheet music. Every movement had a rhythm. She dusted without disturbing framed photographs. She vacuumed beneath chairs rather than around them. She folded blankets so carefully they looked untouched. More than once, homeowners had asked whether she had actually cleaned because nothing appeared moved. Clara took that as a compliment. She believed people should return home feeling peace, not noticing evidence that someone had worked there. Around 9 o'clock, another maid named Denise caught up with her near the west staircase. Denise balanced 3 bottles of wood polish in her arms. You hear about the owner, she whispered. Clara smiled politely. I try not to listen to rumors. This one's probably true. They all are according to the person telling them. Denise laughed. You've got a point. She leaned closer anyway. My cousin worked here years ago. And they say there's one room nobody's allowed to touch. I know. They say even Mr. Brooks hasn't gone inside for years. Clara continued wiping a handrail. I'm sure there's a reason. You aren't curious. Of course. So, why not peek? Clara stopped polishing long enough to look directly at her. Because curiosity isn't more important than someone's trust. Denise blinked. You really think like that? I try to. Before Denise could answer, Margaret appeared at the end of the hallway. Back to work, ladies. The conversation ended immediately. Later that morning, Clara pushed her cart toward the grand central staircase. From there, she could see nearly the entire first floor. Sunlight poured through 30-foot windows, casting long rectangles across white marble. Visitors often described the mansion as luxurious. Clara noticed something different. There were no family photographs newer than 20 years. No shoes left casually by the door. No magazines folded open. No half-finished crossword puzzles. No jackets draped over chairs. Everything looked beautiful. Nothing looked personal. It reminded her of expensive hotels, perfect, temporary. As she polished the brass railing, she noticed Nathaniel walking across the entrance hall. He moved slowly, one hand behind his back. Tall, impeccably dressed. Gray at the temple, calm expression. Employees instinctively stepped aside as he passed. He acknowledged each person with a slight nod. Nothing more. When he reached the staircase, something caught Clara's attention. As Nathaniel adjusted his coat, a brass key slipped partially from his pocket before disappearing again. It wasn't shiny. It wasn't decorative. It looked old enough to belong in another century. Yet Nathaniel touched it with surprising care. Almost instinctively. Almost protectively. For a brief second, Clara wondered why a man who could unlock nearly any door in the city carried such an ordinary-looking key himself, instead of giving it to security. Then she reminded herself that every object carried a story. Some stories simply weren't hers to ask about. That afternoon, while replacing fresh towels in a guest suite, Clara noticed a narrow hallway branching off toward the eastern side of the mansion. Unlike the rest of the house, this corridor received almost no sunlight. The hardwood floor remained spotless despite almost no foot traffic. Several antique wall sconces remained switched off. At the entrance stood a discreet bronze plaque. Authorized access only. Nothing dramatic, nothing mysterious. Just 4 simple words. Yet somehow, they made the hallway feel heavier than the rest of the mansion. Clara turned her cart away immediately. She never even glanced farther inside. From the security office downstairs, Nathaniel happened to be reviewing routine maintenance footage with the estate manager. The cameras cycled automatically through different sections of the property. Front gate, kitchen entrance, garage, north garden, second-floor hallway. For only a moment, camera 12 showed Clara approaching the eastern corridor before quietly turning around without hesitation. Nathaniel barely noticed at first. Then he asked the technician to rewind. Again. The footage played silently. There she was. She paused, read the plaque, turned away. She hadn't tested the door, hadn't looked over her shoulder, hadn't even slowed down long enough to satisfy ordinary curiosity. Most temporary workers lingered there. Some even tried the handle before security reminded them of the rules. She simply respected them. Interesting. Nathaniel said nothing. The technician moved to the next camera. But for the first time in weeks, Nathaniel's attention no longer rested on spreadsheets or renovation budgets. Instead, he found himself thinking about the quiet woman who carried an old canvas bag, arrived early every morning, and somehow treated boundaries she didn't understand with more respect than many people treated promises they had made themselves. Without realizing it, he reached into his pocket once more. His fingers closed around the worn brass key. The metal no longer felt quite as cold. Somewhere deep inside the mansion, a story locked away for more than 2 decades had begun almost imperceptibly to move toward the person who would one day open it, not because she was searching for secrets, but because she had already proven she knew how to honor them. Thursday arrived wrapped in a gray sky that seemed to press lower over Chicago with every passing hour. The weather forecast had warned of heavy lake-effect snow beginning late in the afternoon, but forecasts rarely changed Clara Warren's routine. Bills did not disappear because snow was coming. Apartments did not become warmer because the temperature dropped. People still needed clean homes. She boarded her first bus at 5:42, exactly as she always did, the black leather sketchbook tucked safely inside her canvas bag beneath her lunch container. As the bus crossed the city, she noticed commuters staring anxiously at weather alerts flashing across their phones. "Blizzard warning after 5? Someone muttered. "CTA might suspend routes tonight." Another passenger sighed. "Not again." Clara simply looked out the window. The first snowflakes drifted lazily through the morning air. Beautiful. Almost peaceful. She had lived in Chicago long enough to know beauty could become danger within hours. By 8 o'clock, the Brooks estate was already preparing. Groundskeepers spread salt across every stone pathway. Maintenance crews checked backup generators. Drivers moved luxury vehicles into heated garages. Inside, Eleanor Hayes coordinated deliveries, while Margaret assigned additional housekeeping duties before the storm intensified. "Everyone listen," Margaret called as the morning briefing ended. "The weather's changing faster than expected." She held up her phone. "The city expects 12 to 16 inches before midnight." Several employees exchanged worried looks. "If your supervisor tells you to leave early, don't argue." One of the younger maids raised her hand. "What about tomorrow?" "We'll figure tomorrow out tomorrow." Light laughter rippled through the room. Margaret's expression remained serious. "And keep your phones charged." Clara nodded quietly before collecting her supplies. Her assignment that day covered the second-floor guest suites and the West Library. Nothing unusual. By mid-morning, the snow outside had thickened into swirling white curtains. The massive windows that overlooked Lake Michigan gradually disappeared behind blowing flakes. Inside the mansion, everything remained calm. Fireplaces glowed softly. Classical piano music drifted through hidden speakers. The scent of cedarwood polish mixed with fresh coffee. It felt impossible that only a few miles away, traffic was already slowing to a crawl. Around noon, Clara entered the West Library carrying fresh dust cloths. The room was magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling walnut bookshelves, rolling ladders, leather chairs facing an enormous fireplace. Yet something about the room immediately caught her attention. A framed landscape painting hanging above the mantel leaned ever so slightly to the left. Most people would never notice. Clara did. She set down her supplies, climbed onto a small wooden stool, and carefully straightened the painting until it aligned perfectly with the fireplace below. As she stepped back, a quiet voice spoke behind her. "You noticed." She turned immediately. Nathaniel Brooks stood in the doorway. His hands rested lightly inside the pockets of his charcoal cardigan. I'm sorry, sir," Clara said quickly. "I should have asked before touching it." Nathaniel looked at the painting for several seconds. "My sister always noticed crooked frames." Clara remained silent. "I haven't," he continued softly, "looked closely enough to see that one in months." Neither of them spoke again. Nathaniel gave a slight nod before walking away. The encounter lasted less than 30 seconds, yet Clara couldn't stop thinking about the sentence he had chosen. "My sister always noticed crooked frames, not my late sister, not Olivia. Simply, my sister." As though she still belonged somewhere inside the house. By 3 o'clock, the storm had become violent. Wind slammed against the windows. Tree branches bent under heavy snow. The estate security office received repeated traffic alerts warning residents to avoid unnecessary travel. Margaret checked the forecast again. This isn't good. Denise looked up from folding towels. My husband says they've already closed 2 expressways. Another employee added, the buses are running behind. Clara instinctively reached for her phone. A notification from the Chicago Transit Authority appeared across the screen. Service delays expected. She frowned but returned the phone to her pocket. There was still time. Her last connection usually left downtown just after 7:20. If she finished on schedule, she'd make it. At 4:30, Margaret approached carrying another clipboard. I hate asking this. Clara smiled gently. That usually means you're about to ask. Margaret laughed. The guest wing needs one final inspection. I can do it. It'll probably keep you another 45 minutes. That's fine. You sure? Clara nodded. The sooner we finish, the sooner everyone can go home. By the time the inspection ended, darkness had swallowed the estate. Snow struck the windows almost sideways now. The world beyond the gates had disappeared beneath white and blowing wind. Employees hurried toward their cars. Those who relied on public transportation checked transit apps nervously. Clara finished returning her cleaning supplies before thanking Margaret. Drive carefully. I take the bus. Margaret hesitated. Let me check something. She pulled out her phone. Seconds later, concern crossed her face. Oh no. What happened? They've suspended the Green Line. Clara's heart sank slightly. I don't use the Green Line. I know. Margaret continued scrolling. The route you transferred to? She looked up. It stopped running 20 minutes ago. Clara stared silently. There'll be another one, won't there? Margaret slowly shook her head. Not tonight. Outside, the wind howled against the mansion walls. Denise approached, overhearing the conversation. Come stay with us, she offered immediately. I live 45 minutes west. Clara smiled gratefully. Thank you. But Ethan's expecting me. You can call him. I already did. She glanced at her phone. He says he'll be fine. Margaret folded her arms. What are you going to do? Clara looked through the glass entrance toward the snow-covered road. I'll wait. For what? Maybe another bus. Margaret didn't answer. She already knew there wouldn't be one. At 6:15, Clara stepped outside beneath the covered entrance. The cold hit her instantly. She wrapped her scarf tighter and started walking toward the nearest bus stop nearly half a mile away. Snow reached almost to her ankles. The wind pushed against every step. Behind the mansion, security cameras quietly followed her progress across the front drive. Nathaniel happened to be standing inside the security office reviewing weather reports with the night supervisor. One monitor showed the front gates, another showed the garage. A third displayed the long driveway leading toward the bus stop. His eyes drifted almost absent-mindedly across the screens, then stopped. Camera 7. A lone figure in a dark winter coat walked steadily through blowing snow, pushing forward despite the wind. Who is that? Nathaniel asked. The supervisor leaned closer. Housekeeping. Nathaniel watched another moment. Is she driving? No, sir. Someone picking her up? I don't believe so. Nathaniel said nothing. The image remained on the screen. The woman reached the empty bus shelter, sat down, pulled her scarf tighter, and waited. Minutes passed. No headlights appeared. No buses, no taxis. Only snow. Nathaniel looked away, then back again, still waiting. He remembered another winter, another bus stop, another stubborn person who had insisted everything would be fine. He pushed the memory away immediately. It had been too many years. Yet somehow it returned with startling clarity. He slipped one hand into his pocket. His fingers found the old brass key, as they always did, whenever old memories surfaced. Outside, Clara checked the transit app one last time. A single message appeared in red letters. All remaining routes canceled due to severe weather conditions. She closed her eyes briefly, then looked around. The bus shelter blocked little of the freezing wind. The nearest convenience store had already closed. Walking home would take more than 4 hours in dangerous conditions. She quietly removed her gloves, folded them neatly into her pocket, and accepted the uncomfortable truth. If necessary, she would spend the night on that cold metal bench. She had endured worse. Back inside the mansion, Nathaniel Brooks continued staring at the security monitor far longer than he intended. For reasons he could not yet explain, the sight of the woman sitting alone beneath the swirling snow refused to leave his mind, and before another 10 minutes had passed, he would make a decision he had not made for anyone in more than 2 decades. The wind had become loud enough to erase almost every other sound. Snow swept across the empty road in endless white waves, burying the sidewalks almost as quickly as the city managed to clear them. Clara Warren sat alone beneath the narrow glass roof of the bus shelter, her canvas bag resting on the bench beside her. Every few minutes she checked the transit app again, although she already knew what it would say. No buses, no trains, no service until further notice. She slipped the phone back into her coat pocket and breathed into her gloved hands. Across the street, a pharmacy switched off its lights. A small family diner closed 20 minutes earlier than usual. Within another half hour, the neighborhood became strangely silent. The city had surrendered to the storm. Inside the Brooks estate, warmth wrapped around every room. Logs crackled in the fireplaces. The kitchen staff prepared dinner. Generators hummed quietly beneath the basement. Yet Nathaniel Brooks remained standing inside the security office, his attention fixed on the same monitor. Camera 7. The woman at the bus stop hadn't moved. "How long has she been sitting there?" he asked. The night security supervisor checked the timestamp. 38 minutes, sir." Nathaniel frowned. "Has anyone stopped?" "No." "Any rideshare pickups?" "The roads are almost closed now." The supervisor hesitated before adding quietly, "The police are advising everyone to stay indoors." Nathaniel looked at the screen again. Clara had pulled her scarf higher over her face, but even through the grainy camera image, he could see she wasn't pacing or waving for help. She was simply waiting, patiently, as though discomfort had become something she no longer argued with. Something about that unsettled him. Most people complained when circumstances became unfair. She simply endured them. Without realizing it, he reached once again for the old brass key resting in his pocket. Cold metal met his fingertips. Another memory surfaced. Winter. 23 years earlier. His younger sister Olivia standing outside this very mansion holding a sketch portfolio under one arm. "I'll find another place tonight," she had insisted. "You don't have to worry about me." He had believed her. Or perhaps he had wanted to believe her because it required nothing from him. That had been the last conversation they ever finished. Nathaniel closed his eyes. When he opened them again, Camera 7 still showed Clara sitting alone beneath falling snow. This time he didn't look away. "Bring my coat," he said. The supervisor blinked. "Sir, my coat." Within moments, Nathaniel stepped through the grand front doors into the bitter evening air. The wind struck his face immediately. He hadn't walked to the front gates during a storm in years. Snow crunched beneath polished leather boots as he crossed the long driveway. The estate lights cast golden circles across the whitened ground. By the time he reached the bus shelter, Clara stood instinctively. "Mr. Brooks, you'll freeze out here." She offered a small smile. "I'll be all right." He glanced toward the empty road. "No. I've waded through worse." He looked directly at her. "That isn't the same thing." For several seconds only, the wind answered. Finally, Clara spoke again. "I don't want to inconvenience anyone." Nathaniel almost laughed. The sentence sounded so completely foreign, inside a world where wealthy people inconvenienced others every hour without noticing. You already worked 12 hours today. I was paid. You have nowhere to sleep tonight. I'll figure something out. Nathaniel studied her face carefully. She wasn't asking. She wasn't hoping. She genuinely intended to spend the night wherever circumstances allowed. Perhaps on this bench. Perhaps walking until morning. Whatever happened, she would manage. He suddenly remembered something Eleanor had once said. Some people become so accustomed to carrying burdens alone that they stop recognizing when someone offers to help. He took a slow breath. The guest rooms are empty. Clara looked confused. I'm sorry. You may stay at the estate tonight. She immediately shook her head. I couldn't possibly. You could. It wouldn't be appropriate. You'd rather remain here. She looked toward the storm before answering honestly. No. But this is your home. Nathaniel's expression softened almost imperceptibly. And tonight, he said quietly, it can also be a safe place. Clara still hesitated. I don't have anything suitable to wear. The staff laundry is downstairs. I'll leave before anyone wakes. That's your decision. I don't expect special treatment. I'm not offering special treatment. He looked around at the empty road. I'm offering shelter. The simplicity of the sentence finally reached her. She lowered her eyes. Thank you. They walked back toward the mansion in silence. Neither seemed comfortable speaking. Inside, warm air wrapped around them immediately. One of the house attendants hurried forward. Nathaniel raised a hand. It's all right. He removed his gloves and looked toward Eleanor, who had just entered the foyer. Prepare one of their guest suites. Eleanor nodded automatically. Then Nathaniel stopped her. No? Everyone turned, including Clara. Nathaniel looked at the long hallway stretching behind the grand staircase. 32 bedrooms, dozens of perfectly furnished guest suites. Yet something inside him resisted choosing one. Perhaps because guest rooms still implied distance, still implied that she remained only a temporary employee. He slipped his hand into his coat pocket. His fingers touched the familiar brass key. For several long seconds, he simply held it. Then, almost before he understood why, he removed the entire ring of mansion keys from his pocket. There were more than 40 keys. Silver, steel, modern electronic cards, and one worn brass key, unlike all the others. Nathaniel extended the ring toward Clara. She stared without moving. She whispered. I don't understand. You said you didn't want special treatment. Yes. Then I won't choose a room for you. She looked at the keys again. You may choose. Her eyes widened. Any room? Nathaniel nodded once. Any room in this house. Eleanor looked visibly startled. The security supervisor froze. Even Margaret, who had been preparing to leave for the evening, stopped halfway across the foyer. No one spoke, because everyone present understood something Clara did not. Nathaniel Brooks had never handed those keys to anyone, ever. Clara didn't reach for them immediately. Instead, she asked the one question no one else expected. Are you sure? Nathaniel met her eyes. If I weren't, he replied, I wouldn't be standing here. Slowly, almost reverently, Clara accepted the heavy ring of keys. The brass key rested against her palm. It felt older than the others, warmer somehow. She looked up again. I promise I'll take good care of your home. Nathaniel answered with words that surprised even himself. I think you already have. For a brief second, neither of them moved. Then Eleanor stepped forward. If you need fresh towels or blankets, I'll leave them outside, whichever room you choose. Clara nodded gratefully. Thank you. She started towards the grand staircase before stopping once more. Turning back, she asked quietly, "Mr. Brooks?" "Yes. If there's anywhere you don't want me to enter." Nathaniel looked at the brass key still resting among the others. For one impossible moment, he nearly mentioned the eastern hallway. The room. The promise he had never broken. The grief he had never opened. Instead, he heard himself say something he had not planned. "Choose the room that feels right to you." Clara smiled gently. "I will." She climbed the staircase alone, the keys softly chiming in her hand with every step. Nathaniel remained standing in the entrance hall long after she disappeared from view. High above somewhere, within the vast mansion, dozens of empty rooms waited in perfect silence. He believed he already knew which one she would choose. The largest suite overlooking the lake. The warmest fireplace. The softest bed. After all, anyone exhausted from a 12-hour shift would naturally seek comfort. It never occurred to him that Clara Warren was about to walk past every luxurious bedroom in the mansion without opening a single door. Nor could he imagine that before dawn, the oldest brass key on that ring would guide her toward the one room he had spent 23 years trying not to remember. The ring of keys felt unexpectedly heavy in Clara Warren's hand. As she climbed the broad staircase, the soft metallic chime echoed through the silent mansion. Behind her, the entrance hall gradually disappeared beneath pools of warm light, while above the second floor stretched into long corridors, lined with polished oak doors and antique paintings. She paused at the landing. For the first time that evening, she truly understood what Nathaniel Brooks had entrusted to her. Not a room, not a bed. His home. She looked down at the keys once more. Most were modern, neatly labeled with engraved brass tags: library, wine cellar, West Guest Suite, garden conservatory, workshop. Only one key carried no label: the old brass key. Its edges were worn smooth by decades of use. She wondered briefly what had opened before reminding herself that she had no reason to find out. Nathaniel had offered freedom, not permission, to satisfy curiosity. She slipped the keys carefully into her cardigan pocket and started down the west hallway. The first guest bedroom overlooked the lake. She pushed the door open. A king-sized bed stood beneath a crystal chandelier. Fresh flowers decorated the nightstand. A fire already burned quietly in the marble fireplace. Everything looked elegant enough to belong in a luxury hotel. Clara smiled politely, then closed the door. The next room was even grander: cream-colored silk curtains, hand-carved walnut furniture, soft Persian rugs. She imagined how Ethan would laugh if he saw a bathroom larger than their entire kitchen. Still, she closed that door too. Another suite, another fireplace, another perfectly made bed, another room designed for comfort. She continued walking, not because anything was wrong with them, because none of them felt like they belonged to someone. They felt prepared, maintained, presented. Beautiful places for guests, not places where people had truly lived. Halfway down the hallway, she noticed a narrow side corridor branching east. The lighting changed immediately. Instead of bright chandeliers, smaller wall sconces cast gentle amber circles across darker wooden floors. The air itself seemed quieter, almost reverent. She recognized the corridor. Earlier that week, she had turned away after reading the bronze plaque. Authorized access only. Tonight, the plaque still hung in exactly the same place. She stopped several feet away. For a long moment, she simply stood there. Not because she intended to enter, because she remembered Nathaniel's final words: "Choose the room that feels right to you." She looked back toward the luxurious guest suites, then toward the quiet eastern hallway. Something about this part of the house felt different. Not forbidden, not frightening, simply unfinished. Almost as though the mansion itself held its breath there. She shook the thought away. "I'm imagining things," she whispered to herself. She turned to leave. As she did, the ring of keys shifted inside her pocket. The old brass key slipped free, falling gently against her palm. Its weight surprised her again. Instinctively, she looked down the hallway. Near the very end stood one final wooden door. Unlike every other door in the mansion, this one showed small signs of age. The finish had faded slightly around the handle. Dust rested lightly along the upper frame, despite the otherwise spotless corridor. No decorations surrounded it. No nameplate. Only silence. Clara walked toward it slowly. Not because she planned to enter. Because she intended to make sure it was properly closed before returning downstairs. When she reached it, she noticed something unexpected. The door wasn't completely shut. It remained open perhaps half an inch. Just enough to reveal darkness inside. Cold air drifted gently through the narrow opening. She frowned. Had someone forgotten to latch it? She knocked softly. Hello? No answer. She waited another moment. Still nothing. Very carefully, she pushed the door open another few inches. The room beyond remained almost completely dark, except for the faint moonlight filtering through tall windows. She reached toward the wall, then stopped. Should she? After several seconds, she decided the safest option was simply to close the door and leave. As she gently pushed it inward, the moonlight shifted enough to illuminate part of the room. An easel. Clara froze. Not a decorative easel, a working one. Beside it stood an old drafting table covered with neatly stacked rolls of yellowed architectural paper. Nearby rested shelves filled with fabric samples organized by color, wooden boxes labeled with handwritten notes, small jars holding paintbrushes, a vintage sewing machine. The room wasn't abandoned because no one had cared for it. It had simply been left waiting, almost exactly as someone had walked away from it years earlier. Without thinking, Clara stepped inside. She never touched anything. She simply looked. Every object spoke quietly of a person she had never met. Pinned to one wall were color palettes, carefully arranged with handwritten observations. Morning light warms walnut more than expected. Another note read, "Every room should help someone breathe easier." Clara smiled faintly. That sentence felt strangely familiar. Near the windows stood several scale models of community centers made from cardboard and foam board. Unlike the grand mansion surrounding her, these buildings looked practical, welcoming, designed for ordinary families. One tiny handwritten label read, "Neighborhood Design School." Clara's eyes lingered there. Design school. She whispered the words almost unconsciously. Memories flooded back. Late-night drafting assignments, ink-stained fingertips, studio critiques, dreams she had folded carefully away after Marcus became ill. She walked slowly toward the drafting table. A single pencil still rested exactly where its owner had left it. Beside it sat a reading lamp coated with a thin layer of dust. Without thinking, Clara picked up one of the clean microfiber cloths from her apron. She hesitated. "I'm not changing anything," she murmured. "I'm just—" She searched for the right word. Helping. Very gently, she wiped the dust from the lampshade. Nothing else, just the lamp. The brass base slowly regained its soft golden shine. She smiled, then noticed dust covering the nearby window latch. She cleaned that too, not rearranging, not organizing, simply removing the layer of time that had quietly settled over forgotten objects. Minutes passed. She polished the sewing machine without moving it. She cleaned fingerprints from the window glass. She straightened a folded piece of fabric that had slipped partly onto the floor, but returned it to precisely the same place. Everything remained exactly where it belonged, only cleaner. The room gradually seemed brighter, warmer, more awake. At one point, she found a curtain hanging slightly off its hook. Instead of replacing the entire curtain, she carefully reattached the single loose ring. She stepped back, perfect. No one would even notice she had been there, exactly as she preferred. Hours slipped by, unnoticed. Outside, snow continued falling across Chicago. Inside the mansion, nearly everyone had gone to bed. Eventually, Clara realized how late it had become. She glanced around the room. There was no bed, only a comfortable, upholstered armchair near the fireplace. The fireplace itself hadn't been lit in years. She certainly wasn't about to start one. She folded the blanket Eleanor had left outside into a neat rectangle and placed it over the chair. Before sitting, she looked once around the room. "I hope you don't mind," she whispered softly to the unseen owner. "It felt lonely in here." She settled carefully into the chair, making sure nothing around her was disturbed. The brass key rested quietly on the small table beside her. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the restored lamp, the clean drafting table, and the tiny model labeled Neighborhood Design School. Within minutes, exhaustion overtook her. She fell asleep with one hand resting lightly on her old sketchbook. Around her, the forgotten studio no longer looked abandoned. For the first time in more than 20 years, it looked as though someone had entered not to claim it, but to care for it. Nathaniel Brooks did not sleep well that night. He rarely did. The storm battered the mansion until after midnight, rattling old window panes and bending centuries-old oak trees beneath heavy snow. Yet it wasn't the wind that kept him awake. It was a memory. At first it came only as fragments. A young woman laughing while balancing 3 paint samples against the dining room wall. The smell of fresh coffee drifting through an unfinished studio. Someone humming softly while sketching beside a tall window. Then the memories grew clear. 28 years earlier, before Brooks Hospitality became one of the largest hotel companies in the country, the mansion had been filled with construction crews. Nathaniel, then in his late 30s, spent nearly every waking hour expanding the business. Investors called constantly. Hotels opened in new cities every few months. Every success demanded another sacrifice. His younger sister, Olivia Brooks, had been 27. Where Nathaniel saw buildings as investments, Olivia saw them as places where lives unfolded. She had graduated at the top of her interior design program with awards for community-centered architecture. Her professors believed she could have joined any prestigious design firm in New York or Los Angeles. Instead, she came home. "I want to work here," she told Nathaniel one evening, while they stood inside the unfinished East Wing. He looked surprised. "You'll have much bigger opportunities elsewhere." "I don't want bigger. I want meaningful." She spread dozens of hand-drawn sketches across an old drafting table. Nathaniel remembered that moment perfectly. She had been wearing faded blue jeans covered with pencil dust and an oversized cream sweater with the sleeves rolled halfway to her elbows. Her eyes sparkled every time she explained an idea. "This room could become a design studio." She pointed toward another drawing. "These classrooms could teach women who never had the chance to study." Another page. "Community workshops." Another. "Affordable housing projects designed with dignity." Nathaniel smiled patiently. "They're beautiful ideas. They're real ideas. They don't make money." Olivia looked directly at him. "They make lives better." Nathaniel folded the drawings carefully. "I've spent years building this company." "I know. We finally have enough resources to expand nationally. I'm proud of you. So understand why I can't finance a school that may never become sustainable." Olivia remained silent for a long moment. Finally, she asked quietly, "Have you ever noticed something?" "What?" "When you talk about hotels, you always say occupancy rates, operating costs, growth." She smiled sadly. "But when I imagine buildings, I see people." Nathaniel laughed gently. "That's why you're the artist. And you're the businessman." Neither realized how important that conversation would become. Over the following months, Olivia transformed the Eastern studio into a place unlike any other room in the mansion. Large drafting tables filled the center. Shelves overflowed with recycled wood samples, handmade textiles, and community design books. Children from local schools sometimes visited on weekends to build miniature neighborhoods from cardboard. Neighborhood volunteers dropped off donated fabric. Retired carpenters taught free woodworking classes. The mansion, once quiet, filled again with conversation and creativity. Nathaniel tolerated it. He even admired Olivia's determination. But whenever she mentioned opening a permanent nonprofit design school, the discussion always ended the same way. "It's too expensive. We'll find another way. You should focus on commercial work." "I don't want commercial work." "You've earned the right to think bigger." "I already am." She never argued loudly. Neither did he. Their disagreements remained calm, almost polite, which somehow made the distance between them grow even faster. One autumn afternoon, Olivia walked into Nathaniel's office carrying a thick proposal binder. "I've finished the budget." Nathaniel barely looked up from financial reports. "For what?" "The school." She placed the binder on his desk. "I found grants, volunteer instructors, unused city buildings. We don't even need that much funding." Nathaniel sighed. "We've discussed this." "No. We've postponed it." He finally looked at her. "Olivia, this isn't the right time." She smiled faintly. "When will it be?" "When the company is stable." She glanced around the enormous office. "The company owns 34 hotels. It isn't stable. It never will be." She closed the binder herself. "I think," she whispered, "You've forgotten why you wanted to build things in the first place." Nathaniel didn't answer. She left quietly. It was the last disagreement they ever had. 3 weeks later, Olivia traveled north to meet a nonprofit housing organization interested in her community design project. The weather forecast predicted light rain. Instead, freezing roads caused a chain reaction collision outside Milwaukee. Nathaniel remembered every detail of the phone call, the silence before the hospital administrator spoke, the impossible feeling that someone had mistaken another family for his. He drove through the night. By dawn, Olivia was gone. She had never regained consciousness. Among the few belongings recovered from her car was a leather portfolio filled with unfinished sketches. On the first page, she had written only one sentence: "Every room should help someone breathe easier." Nathaniel couldn't bear to throw anything away. He carried the portfolio home himself. The studio remained exactly as Olivia had left it. The pencil still rested beside the drafting table. Fabric samples remained organized by color. The reading lamp stayed pointed toward the easel. He locked the room. He slipped the brass key into his pocket. Then he never opened the door again. At first he believed it would remain closed for a week, then a month, then until he felt ready. Years passed. Staff changed. Friends stopped asking. Eventually, the mansion developed its own unspoken rule. The East Studio did not exist. Only Eleanor knew the full story. Margaret knew only that one room remained permanently locked. Everyone else simply obeyed instructions. Nathaniel carried the brass key every day, not because he planned to use it, because putting it down somehow felt like leaving Olivia behind. He touched it before important meetings, before signing billion-dollar contracts, before every Christmas dinner eaten alone. It became less a key than a promise he had never understood how to keep. That night, as snow continued falling beyond his bedroom window, Nathaniel stood looking across the dark mansion toward the eastern wing. A faint light glowed beneath one distant doorway. The studio. For the first time in 23 years. He should have felt alarmed. Instead, he felt something far stranger. Hope. It frightened him. Could a single night really matter? Could one quiet housekeeper possibly understand a room even he had been unable to face? He almost walked there immediately. His hand even reached the bedroom door. Then he stopped. No. If Clara had chosen that room, she deserved privacy, just as Olivia always had. Nathaniel returned to the window. Far below, snow softened every sharp edge of the estate. The gardens, the pathways, the stone walls. Everything looked gentler beneath winter's blanket. Without realizing it, he smiled for the first time in so many years that the expression felt unfamiliar on his own face. Elsewhere in the mansion, Clara slept peacefully in the old armchair, unaware of the history surrounding her. The reading lamp she had cleaned reflected pale moonlight across the drafting table. The tiny model labeled Neighborhood Design School stood quietly beside her sketchbook. Two women, separated by 23 years. One had dreamed of designing spaces that helped ordinary people live with dignity. The other had quietly sacrificed the very same dream to care for the people she loved. Neither had ever met. Yet as dawn slowly approached Chicago, their stories had already begun to overlap in ways that would change Nathaniel Brooks forever. Nathaniel Brooks woke before dawn. For several moments he lay motionless, listening. The storm had finally weakened. Instead of violent wind, only the occasional whisper of snow brushing against the windows disturbed the silence. His bedside clock read 5:57. Normally, he would begin his routine immediately. Coffee, reports, emails. Instead, he found himself staring toward the eastern side of the mansion, the studio. A faint uneasiness settled over him. Not fear, anticipation. For more than 23 years, every morning had begun with the certainty that Olivia's room remained untouched. Today, for the first time, that certainty no longer existed. He dressed quietly and left his bedroom without calling for anyone. The hallways remained empty. Most of the staff would not arrive for another 2 hours because of the snowstorm. The mansion felt unusually peaceful. As Nathaniel descended the main staircase, he noticed Eleanor arranging fresh flowers in the entrance hall. She looked surprised. "Good morning, sir." "Good morning. You're up early." "I couldn't sleep." Eleanor hesitated before asking the question that had clearly been on her mind all night. "Would you like me to check on Ms. Warren?" Nathaniel considered the offer, then slowly shook his head. "No. If she's still resting, let her rest." Eleanor smiled almost imperceptibly. "Very well." She watched him walk away, already knowing exactly where he was going. Nathaniel crossed the marble foyer without speaking. Each step toward the eastern corridor felt strangely heavier than the last. He hadn't walked this way in years. The bronze plaque still hung beside the hallway. Authorized access only. He stopped in front of it. For countless mornings he had turned away here. Today he continued forward. The corridor looked exactly as he remembered. Dark walnut flooring, amber wall sconces, paintings Olivia herself had selected decades earlier. Even the faint scent of cedar seemed unchanged. When he reached the final door, he noticed something immediately. The narrow strip of light beneath it. His pulse quickened. Someone was awake. Very gently, he placed one hand on the brass handle. He hesitated. What if the room no longer looked the same? What if, despite her good intentions, something precious had been moved? What if memories he had protected for 23 years had been erased in a single night? He closed his eyes briefly, then turned the handle. The door opened silently. Morning sunlight poured through the tall eastern windows. For one suspended heartbeat, Nathaniel couldn't understand what he was seeing. Nothing had been rearranged. The drafting tables stood exactly where Olivia had left them. The easel remained beside the windows. Fabric samples still rested in their carefully organized shelves. The miniature community center models occupied the same cabinet. The old reading lamp pointed toward the easel exactly as before. Every object remained in its proper place. Yet the room somehow felt alive. The windows sparkled with clean glass. Dust no longer dulled the wooden furniture. Soft winter light reflected warmly across polished surfaces. Even the air seemed lighter. Near the fireplace, Clara Warren slept peacefully in the upholstered chair. A folded blanket rested neatly across her lap. Her old sketchbook remained open beside one hand. She hadn't slept in Olivia's bed. There wasn't one. She hadn't touched the drawings. She hadn't searched through personal belongings. Instead, she had simply cared for the room. Nathaniel's eyes slowly moved across the studio. The sewing machine gleamed gently. The lampshade had been carefully cleaned. A loose curtain ring had been reattached. One stack of design journals leaned perfectly upright after years of gradually tilting. No dramatic changes, just dozens of quiet acts of respect. Then he noticed something resting beside Clara's sketchbook, a small microfiber cloth, folded into a perfect square. He understood immediately. She hadn't come to claim the room. She had come to protect it. His breathing became uneven. Without realizing it, he stepped farther inside. His shoe lightly brushed against a small wooden stool. The sound woke Clara instantly. She opened her eyes, confused for only a second before recognizing him. She stood so quickly the blanket nearly slipped to the floor. "Mr. Brooks." "I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have—" She stopped herself. Nathaniel remained silent. His eyes continued moving around the room. "I know you told me to choose," Clara began softly. "But if I've crossed a boundary, I'll leave immediately." Still no answer. Her heart sank. Perhaps she had misunderstood his kindness. Perhaps this room truly had been forbidden. "I noticed the window wasn't fully closed," she explained carefully. "I only wanted to make sure snow wasn't getting inside." She swallowed. There was dust on the lamp. And the windows. "I didn't move anything. I promise." Nathaniel slowly walked towards the drafting table. His fingers rested gently upon its smooth wooden surface. He hadn't touched it in more than 2 decades. There beside the lamp lay one of Olivia's old pencils. Exactly where it had always been. Nothing missing, nothing disturbed, only clean. His gaze shifted toward the window. Beyond the glass, fresh snow-covered Lake Michigan in brilliant white. For years he had remembered this room as frozen in grief. Now sunlight filled every corner. His eyes stopped on a handwritten note pinned to the inspiration board. "Every room should help someone breathe easier." He whispered the sentence aloud. Clara looked surprised. "I read that?" Nathaniel nodded faintly. "My sister wrote it." Silence settled between them. After a long moment, Clara spoke. "I hope you don't think I was disrespectful." Nathaniel turned toward her. Instead of answering immediately, he asked quietly, "Why this room?" Clara glanced around before speaking. "I walked past every guest suite. They were beautiful." They were, but she searched for the right words. This room felt— She hesitated. Unfinished. Nathaniel lowered his eyes. "I know that may sound strange. It doesn't. It felt like someone had left in the middle of a conversation." She looked toward the drafting table. "I couldn't explain it. I just—" She smiled sadly. "Didn't want it to spend another night feeling lonely." Nathaniel felt something inside him break. Not violently, not dramatically. Like ice slowly giving way beneath the first warmth of spring. His eyes blurred. He blinked once, twice. Then, despite every attempt to remain composed, tears gathered quietly. Clara pretended not to notice. She respectfully lowered her gaze toward the floor. Nathaniel stepped closer to the window. The light illuminated every detail Olivia had loved. The polished lamp, the restored curtain, the tiny cardboard model labeled Neighborhood Design School. Suddenly, another object caught his attention. Near Clara's chair lay her own sketchbook. It had fallen slightly open during the night. He could see a pencil drawing, not of the mansion, not of luxury, a modest community library, children reading near wide windows, accessible ramps, warm lighting, simple furniture designed with dignity. His breath caught. The style, the purpose, the heart behind the drawing. It reminded him painfully of Olivia. Clara noticed where he was looking. "I'm sorry." She quickly reached for the sketchbook. I didn't mean to leave it open." Nathaniel gently raised one hand. "You studied design?" She nodded. "A long time ago." "What happened?" "My husband became sick. I left school. I never went back." Nathaniel looked again at the sketch. Years of regret, loneliness, and unanswered promises seemed to converge inside one silent moment. Then, his coffee cup still resting in his hand from the kitchen, slipped from his fingers. It struck the hardwood floor. Porcelain shattered across the room. Dark coffee spread between the floorboards. The sharp sound echoed through the mansion. Neither of them moved. Nathaniel wasn't looking at the broken cup. He was looking at Clara's drawing, at Olivia's unfinished dream. And for the first time in 23 years, he realized that perhaps the room had not been waiting for memories. Perhaps it had been waiting for the right person to walk through its door. The sound of breaking porcelain echoed through the eastern wing for several long seconds before silence settled once again. Dark coffee spread slowly across the polished hardwood floor. Neither Nathaniel nor Clara moved. The broken cup seemed insignificant compared to everything else that had shattered inside the room. Nathaniel was the first to lower his eyes. "I'll clean that immediately," Clara said softly. She instinctively reached for the folded microfiber cloth beside the chair. Before she could kneel, Nathaniel spoke. "Leave it." She looked up, uncertain she had heard correctly. "It's all right. But the floor? It can wait." Clara slowly folded the cloth back into her hands. For years, cleaning had been her instinctive answer to every uncomfortable moment. A spill, a stain, a mess, those were problems she knew how to solve. This was different. Nathaniel walked slowly toward the large windows overlooking the frozen shoreline of Lake Michigan. Snow reflected brilliant morning light into the studio. He stared outside for a long time before speaking. "I haven't stood in this room since my sister died." Clara remained silent. She sensed this was not a conversation to interrupt. "I used to believe leaving everything untouched would preserve her." A faint smile crossed his face. "It didn't. It only preserved my grief." He looked around the studio. "I convinced myself that protecting the room meant locking it." His gaze settled on the polished reading lamp. "But you came in here, and somehow respected every memory without imprisoning it." Clara carefully chose her words. "I don't think memories need dust to survive." Nathaniel turned toward her. She immediately worried she had spoken too boldly. "I'm sorry." "I didn't mean no." He shook his head gently. "I needed to hear that." He looked around again. "The strange thing is, I've walked through every other room in this mansion thousands of times. But this room," he smiled sadly, "I stopped seeing it." Clara glanced toward Olivia's handwritten notes. "When I first walked in, I didn't think it looked abandoned." Nathaniel seemed surprised. "No." She slowly shook her head. "It looked interrupted." He frowned thoughtfully. "Interrupted. As though someone intended to come back tomorrow." Her eyes wandered across the drafting tables. "The projects weren't finished. The ideas weren't finished. The room itself wasn't finished." Nathaniel whispered almost to himself, "She always hated leaving things unfinished." For a while they simply stood together. Morning sunlight gradually brightened every corner of the studio. Nathaniel's eyes fell once more upon Clara's sketchbook. "May I She hesitated only briefly before handing it to him. The cover had softened with age. Corners were worn. Elastic bands had been replaced several times with simple string. Clearly it had traveled with her for years. Nathaniel opened it carefully. The first pages contained quick pencil studies, neighborhood parks, bus shelters, libraries, children's reading rooms, accessible kitchens, community gardens. Nothing extravagant. Everything practical. Everything designed for ordinary families. As he continued turning pages, he noticed annotations written neatly beside many drawings. Natural light reduces electricity costs. Lower counters allow wheelchair access. Wide hallways help parents with strollers. Use recycled materials whenever possible. He looked up. "You've never stopped designing?" Clara smiled faintly. "I stopped calling myself a designer." "That's different." She laughed softly. "I suppose it is." Nathaniel turned another page. There he found sketches of affordable apartments. Each drawing included handwritten notes about dignity, privacy, comfort. Small details most developers rarely considered. He closed the sketchbook gently. "Why didn't you return to school?" Clara folded her hands. "Life became expensive. My husband was diagnosed with kidney disease. We spent everything on treatment." Nathaniel listened quietly. "After Marcus passed away. Ethan was 12. I had bills. I needed steady work. So I cleaned houses." She smiled without bitterness. "I discovered something interesting." "What?" "People reveal themselves through the spaces they leave behind." Nathaniel looked intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I've cleaned homes where every expensive object was perfectly polished, but no one spoke kindly to one another." She paused. "I've cleaned tiny apartments where the furniture barely matched. Yet every corner felt loved." Nathaniel considered that carefully. "And this house?" Clara looked around the studio. "The mansion is beautiful." She hesitated. "But it has been waiting." He almost smiled. "Waiting for what?" "I wasn't sure. Until this morning." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "And now?" She looked directly at him. "I think it has been waiting for someone to remember why it was built." The words settled deeply. Nathaniel slowly walked toward one of Olivia's miniature building models, Neighborhood Design School. He picked it up carefully. He had not touched it in 23 years. Dust no longer covered its tiny windows. Clara had cleaned every delicate surface without damaging a single detail. "She built this model herself," he said. "It took almost 3 months." Clara leaned closer. "The craftsmanship is remarkable." Nathaniel nodded. "She wanted children who couldn't afford design school to learn here." He laughed quietly. "I told her there wasn't enough demand." Clara examined the miniature classroom. She disagreed. Very politely. "What did she say?" Nathaniel's eyes drifted into memory. "She said talent isn't rare. Opportunity is." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter. "She was right." Nathaniel slowly set the model back down. "I know." For the first time, there was no defensiveness in his voice, only acceptance. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. Eleanor stood outside the partially open door. "I apologize for disturbing you." Nathaniel turned. "What is it?" "Breakfast is ready." She hesitated. "The roads are still closed, so the morning staff won't arrive for several more hours." Nathaniel nodded. "Thank you." As Eleanor prepared to leave, her eyes briefly swept across the studio. She stopped. Her lips parted almost imperceptibly. The room... It looked alive again. She quietly closed the door behind her without saying another word. Nathaniel turned back toward Clara. "You haven't eaten?" She smiled. "Neither have you." A faint laugh escaped him. No, I suppose neither of us has. They walked together toward the hallway. Before leaving, Clara paused beside the doorway. She looked back once more. The sunlight now filled nearly every corner of Olivia's studio. I'll come back later and clean the coffee stain. Nathaniel followed her gaze. No. She looked puzzled. I'll clean it. You don't have to. I know. He smiled gently. But perhaps it's time I started taking care of this room myself. For several seconds, neither spoke. It was a small sentence, yet Clara understood its weight. He wasn't talking about coffee. He was talking about grief. As they stepped into the hallway, Nathaniel quietly locked the studio again. Then he looked down at the old brass key in his hand. For 23 years, it had symbolized loss. This morning, for the first time, it felt like something else. Not a lock, a beginning. Without saying a word, he extended the key ring toward Clara. She blinked in surprise. I thought these belonged to you. They do? I should return them. Nathaniel gently closed her fingers around the ring. Keep them. Mr. Brooks, you've already shown me something I couldn't see myself. She looked uncertain. I've only cleaned a room. He smiled. No. You reminded me that some doors are meant to be opened. As they walked downstairs together, neither noticed Margaret standing quietly at the far end of the corridor. She had arrived early despite the snowstorm. From a distance, she watched the billionaire and the housekeeper descend the staircase, side by side, speaking with calm familiarity. In all her years working for Nathaniel Brooks, she had never seen him walk beside an employee like that. Not once. Something profound had changed overnight. She simply didn't know what. Neither, perhaps, did Nathaniel himself. By the following Monday, Chicago had returned to its familiar rhythm. Snowbanks still lined the streets, but buses ran on schedule again. Downtown traffic crawled across bridges spanning the frozen river, and Brooks Hospitality resumed its relentless pace of meetings, acquisitions, and expansion plans. Inside the mansion, however, something subtle had changed. Nathaniel Brooks now walked through the eastern hallway every morning. He still carried the brass key. The difference was that he used it. At exactly 7 o'clock, he unlocked Olivia's studio, opened the windows just enough to let fresh air circulate, and stood quietly for several minutes before beginning his workday. He never rearranged anything. He simply allowed the room to breathe again. The staff noticed. No one commented. Some changes deserved silence. Clara returned to her normal schedule as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She polished marble floors, changed linens, dusted bookshelves, helped new employees learn proper restoration techniques for antique furniture. If anyone expected her to behave differently after spending a night inside the mansion, they were disappointed. She remained exactly the same. The only difference was that each afternoon after finishing her assigned work, she spent 15 minutes inside Olivia's studio. Never longer. Always with permission. She dusted gently, opened the curtains, checked for moisture around the windows. Nothing more. It became another room under her care. Margaret watched this quiet routine for nearly 2 weeks before finally asking Nathaniel a question. They happened to be reviewing maintenance reports in his office. Sir, yes. The Eastern Studio. Nathaniel looked up. What about it? Should I add it back to the cleaning schedule? He considered the question. No. Margaret seemed surprised. No. Only Clara. Just Clara. Yes. Margaret nodded. She asked no further questions. She trusted his judgment, yet curiosity lingered. One Thursday afternoon, she happened to pass the studio while Clara worked inside. The door stood open. Clara wasn't cleaning. She was kneeling beside one of the miniature neighborhood models, carefully repairing a tiny wooden bench that had loosened with age. She wasn't replacing it. She wasn't redesigning it. She was preserving it. Margaret smiled quietly before continuing down the hallway. Now she understood. Clara treated the room as though it belonged to someone she respected, not someone she wished to become. Later that evening, Nathaniel entered the studio carrying a slim leather portfolio. Clara immediately stood. "I didn't hear you." "I know." He placed the portfolio on the drafting table. "I found these." She looked down. Inside were dozens of architectural sketches. Every page carried Olivia's signature. Community libraries, women's shelters, children's hospitals, affordable apartments filled with sunlight rather than luxury. Clara turned each page with extraordinary care. "These are beautiful." Nathaniel nodded. "They've been stored in my office safe for 23 years. She looked at him. "Why are you showing them to me?" He answered honestly. "Because I finally realized they deserve to be seen." For nearly an hour they studied the drawings together. Nathaniel explained which ideas had eventually appeared inside Brooks' hotels: small reading corners, accessible room layouts, healing gardens outside medical conference centers. "I used more of her ideas than I ever admitted." Clara smiled gently. "She probably knew." Nathaniel laughed softly. "She probably did." Eventually, Clara reached one unfinished drawing: a community design center with classrooms surrounding a shared workshop. Across the top, Olivia had written Phase 2, funding pending. Nothing else. Clara traced the empty spaces with her eyes. It was never finished. No. Nathaniel looked at the page for a long time. She wanted students from working-class neighborhoods to learn architecture and design. I kept telling her the project wasn't practical. And now, he looked directly at Clara, I think practicality became my excuse. Silence filled the room once again. Finally, Nathaniel closed the portfolio. "I've made a decision." Clara waited. "The Brooks Foundation has funded hospitals, scholarships, research, historic preservation." He paused. "But never this." She looked at him curiously. "I want to build Olivia's school." Clara's eyes widened. "The actual school?" "Yes." "The one she designed?" He smiled, as closely as possible. She instinctively looked back toward the unfinished drawing. "That would change many lives." "I hope so." Nathaniel hesitated. "There's one problem." "What is it?" "I don't know how to finish her plans." Clara lowered her eyes. "I'm not the right person." He frowned. "Why not?" "I never completed my degree." "You completed far more than that." She shook her head. "I'm a housekeeper." Nathaniel smiled. "No? You earn your living as a housekeeper. That isn't the same thing." She looked uncertain. He continued calmly. "I've watched you restore furniture without changing its character. I've watched you preserve this room with extraordinary restraint. I've seen your sketches. I've listened to how you think about people before buildings." He opened her sketchbook, which rested on the nearby table. "You already design exactly the way Olivia did." Clara swallowed. "I don't have professional credentials." "Neither did my grandfather when he built his first hotel." She almost laughed. "That's different." "It isn't?" Nathaniel closed the sketchbook again. "I don't need a famous architect to tell me what this project should become. I need someone who understands why it exists." She looked away towards the windows. Outside, children walked home from school through melting snow. "I wouldn't know where to begin." "You wouldn't begin alone." He walked to the bookshelf and removed a thick binder. Inside were architectural licensing contacts, engineering firms, nonprofit partners, and city planning documents. "I've already assembled a team." She stared at him. "When?" "The day after the storm." "You planned this?" "I hoped." He smiled honestly. "I wasn't sure you'd say yes." Clara laughed nervously. "I haven't said yes." I know. He handed her the unfinished drawing. I'd like you to think about it. No pressure. No deadline. Simply think. She accepted the page carefully. That evening, after returning to her apartment, Clara placed Olivia's drawing beside her own old sketchbook on the kitchen table. Ethan noticed immediately. What's that? She smiled. A dream. He examined the drawing. It looks amazing. It was? The woman who started it passed away. He studied the design quietly, then looked back at his mother. You want to finish it? She didn't answer immediately. I don't know if I can. Ethan laughed. Mom! She looked up. I've watched you fix things my entire life. Broken furniture? Broken apartments? Broken people. You've never walked away because something wasn't finished. He gently pushed the drawing closer to her. So why start now? Clara looked at her son, then at Olivia's unfinished school. For the first time in many years, the dream she had buried no longer felt impossible, only frightening. And sometimes she realized those were not the same thing. Clara barely slept that night. Olivia's unfinished drawing remained spread across her kitchen table long after Ethan had gone to bed. Beside it lay her own worn sketchbook. 2 dreams. One interrupted by tragedy. The other abandoned by necessity. For hours she compared the drawings, not because she believed they were equal. They weren't. Olivia's work possessed the confidence of a professionally trained designer. Her proportions were precise. Her circulation paths flowed naturally. Every classroom connected elegantly with shared creative spaces. Clara's sketches, by comparison, looked quieter, less ambitious, more practical. She noticed where she instinctively added extra storage for winter coats, wider waiting areas for exhausted parents, and benches positioned where elderly visitors could rest. Different experiences had shaped different priorities. Yet the more she looked, the more she realized something unexpected. Their philosophies were remarkably similar. Neither woman designed impressive buildings. They designed welcoming ones. The following afternoon, Clara arrived at Brooks' estate, carrying a cardboard tube under one arm. Inside were several fresh drawings she had made before sunrise. She had almost left them at home 3 different times. When Nathaniel saw the tube, he smiled. You've been thinking? A little? I hoped you would. They walked together toward Olivia's studio. Nathaniel unlocked the door with the brass key before quietly stepping aside. You first. Clara entered. The room already felt different now that sunlight, fresh air, and regular care had returned. It no longer resembled a museum. It felt like a workspace patiently waiting for someone to continue. She carefully unrolled her drawings across the large drafting table. Nathaniel remained silent while studying them. The first drawing preserved Olivia's original building almost exactly. The second introduced subtle adjustments. An accessible entrance replacing the steep front stairs. Flexible classrooms with movable walls. Larger community kitchens. Outdoor gardens connected directly to workshop spaces. The third drawing focused entirely on neighborhood use. Evenings for adults returning from work. Weekend classes for children. Shared studio space for local artists unable to afford commercial rent. Nathaniel examined every page without rushing. Finally, he looked up. You changed surprisingly little. I didn't think it needed much. She pointed toward Olivia's original plan. This was already beautiful. I only asked myself, what would families need today? Nathaniel nodded slowly. And they still need exactly what your sister wanted. Opportunity. She smiled gently. Only now they also need flexibility. He laughed softly. She would have liked that answer. At that moment, Eleanor entered, carrying tea for both of them. She stopped immediately, upon seeing the drafting table covered with fresh architectural drawings. For several seconds, she simply stared. Then she quietly placed the tray down. "I haven't seen this table used since Miss Olivia." Neither Clara nor Nathaniel spoke. Eleanor slowly approached. Her eyes filled with emotion as she recognized Olivia's handwriting beside Clara's newer notes. "They look—" She searched for the right words. "Like they're having a conversation." Clara looked at the drawings again. She had never thought about them that way. Nathaniel smiled. "I believe they are." Later that week, Nathaniel arranged a meeting unlike any Brooks hospitality had hosted before. Instead of executives in expensive suits discussing hotel investments, the mansion's conference room welcomed architects, nonprofit directors, educators, accessibility specialists, and community leaders from neighborhoods across Chicago. Clara nearly turned around when she saw everyone waiting. "I don't belong here." Nathaniel heard her. "You absolutely do. They're professionals." "So are you." "No, I'm not." He looked directly at her. "I didn't invite you because of your job title. I invited you because this project needs your perspective." She reluctantly entered the room. Several guests immediately assumed she was part of the catering staff. One architect handed her his empty coffee cup without looking up from his laptop. "Could I trouble you for a refill?" Before Clara could respond, Nathaniel reached across the table and took the cup himself. "I'll handle that." The room fell completely silent. Nathaniel placed the untouched cup back in front of its owner. "Allow me to introduce someone." He turned toward Clara. "This is Clara Warren. She is serving as the lead community design advisor for this project." The architect's face flushed crimson. "I'm terribly sorry." Clara smiled politely. "It's all right." Nathaniel continued. "The purpose of today's meeting isn't to create the most impressive building. It's to create the most useful one." He gestured toward Clara. "She'll explain why." Every eye turned toward her. Her hands trembled slightly. She had spoken to co-workers, to church volunteers, to parents at Ethan's school, never to a room filled with nationally recognized professionals. She inhaled slowly, then looked not at the architects, but at Olivia's drawing projected onto the large screen. "When I cleaned houses," she began quietly, "I noticed something." People leaned forward. "The most expensive rooms weren't always the ones people loved." She paused. "The rooms people remembered were the ones where they felt safe." Silence filled the room. She continued more confidently. "A classroom isn't successful because it looks beautiful. It's successful because a teenager who's convinced they don't belong walks inside anyway." She pointed toward one section of the plan. "This entrance shouldn't intimidate anyone." Another page. "This workshop should be visible from the lobby, so children immediately understand they're allowed to create here." Another. "The library should sit beside the cafe, so grandparents waiting for grandchildren have somewhere welcoming to spend an hour." One by one, the professionals began writing notes. Nobody interrupted. Nobody questioned her credentials. They simply listened. An accessibility consultant finally raised his hand. "I've attended hundreds of planning meetings. I don't think I've ever heard anyone explain space quite like that." Another architect nodded. "We spend years discussing circulation. You just reminded us we're designing experiences." Nathaniel quietly watched from the far end of the table. He barely spoke for the rest of the afternoon. He didn't need to. The room already understood why Clara belonged there. When the meeting ended, several participants remained behind. One elderly architect approached Clara. "My name is Leonard Pierce. I taught interior architecture for 38 years." She smiled politely. "It's an honor." He shook his head. "The honor is mine." He reached into his briefcase and removed an old business card. "If you ever decide to complete your degree, I know several universities that would welcome you." Clara accepted the card with visible surprise. "I don't know what to say." You don't need to. He smiled warmly. Just promise me one thing. What? Don't spend another 20 years believing you're only a housekeeper. After everyone departed, Nathaniel remained alone inside the conference room. The walls were still covered with design sketches and handwritten ideas. Community, dignity, access, belonging, hope. He recognized every one of those words. Olivia had written them decades earlier. Now new voices were repeating them. Not because they had copied her, because timeless ideas always found new hearts willing to carry them forward. Nathaniel gently folded Olivia's original drawing. Then, without hesitation, placed Clara's updated version directly on top of it. The old plan had begun the dream. The new one would finally allow it to live. Construction began in early spring. Not on a luxury hotel. Not on another conference center bearing the Brooks name. Instead, an aging brick warehouse on Chicago's South Side slowly transformed into something the neighborhood had not seen in decades, a place built not to generate profit but to create possibility. A temporary wooden sign stood at the entrance, future home of the Olivia Brooks Community Design Studio. Nathaniel refused to add his own name. When the communications department suggested calling it the Brooks Design Institute, he quietly declined. This dream existed before I understood it. It deserves the name of the person who imagined it. Every Friday afternoon, after finishing her housekeeping shift, Clara drove across the city to the construction site. She still wore the same navy housekeeping uniform. Steel-toed boots had replaced her usual shoes, and a yellow safety helmet covered her neatly tied curls. The construction workers greeted her warmly. "Afternoon, Miss Warren. Good to see you." At first, they had assumed she was another project coordinator. They quickly learned otherwise. She noticed things no blueprint could reveal. One afternoon, she stopped beside the main entrance. "Can we move this bench 6 feet closer to the door?" The site manager frowned. "Why?" She looked toward the sidewalk. "A grandmother carrying groceries and waiting for a child after class shouldn't have to stand in the rain." The bench was moved. Another day she walked into the woodworking classroom. "The windows need to be lower." An engineer checked the drawings. "They already meet code." "I know," she smiled, "but 8-year-olds should be able to see outside while they're sitting." The windows were lowered. Again and again, Clara's suggestions had nothing to do with prestige, everything to do with people. Soon the architects stopped asking whether her ideas met regulations. Instead, they began asking a different question. What would Clara notice? One morning, Leonard Pierce, the retired architecture professor, arrived carrying several thick textbooks. "I thought these belonged with you." Clara laughed nervously. "I haven't studied from books like these in 20 years. "Then perhaps it's time." Each Friday became something new. Morning, she polished silver in the mansion dining room. Afternoon, she discussed natural daylight circulation patterns and classroom layouts beside construction crews. The contrast amused Nathaniel. One evening he found her changing from dusty work boots back into her housekeeping shoes before driving home. "You know," he said, leaning against his car, "most people would have resigned by now." She looked puzzled. "Resigned? You spend your afternoons helping build the school. You've earned that opportunity." Clara smiled while tying her shoes. "I gave you my word." "What word?" "I said I'd continue taking care of your home." Nathaniel laughed quietly. "You really meant it." "I always do." He studied her for a moment. "I'd like to offer you something." She immediately became cautious. "What is it?" "A full-time position directing the studio once construction is complete." She stared at him. "You mean—" "No more housekeeping." The words hung gently in the evening air. For years, Clara had imagined hearing something like them. She should have accepted immediately. Instead, she looked back toward the mansion. "I'd like to finish what I started." Nathaniel frowned slightly. The house. She nodded. When I first arrived, it didn't feel like home. He smiled knowingly. And now, it does. I'd like to leave it better than I found it. Nathaniel didn't argue. He simply nodded. I understand. A few weeks later, Ethan visited the construction site for the first time. Now 17, taller than his mother, he wandered through unfinished classrooms with wide eyes. This is incredible. Clara watched him explore. You like it? I love it. He paused inside the computer lab. Kids are really going to learn here. That's the plan. He walked toward one wall covered with design sketches. Among them hung one of Clara's original pencil drawings. Someone had framed it. She blinked in surprise. I didn't know they kept that. Nathaniel, who had quietly entered behind them, smiled. It reminded everyone why we started. Ethan looked from the framed drawing to his mother. You drew this. She nodded shyly. A while ago. He laughed. Mom! You've been hiding. She raised an eyebrow. Hiding? I grew up thinking you just cleaned houses. She smiled. I thought so too. Nathaniel overheard the exchange. Later that afternoon, he found himself alone inside what would become the main library. Sunlight streamed through tall windows exactly as Olivia had once envisioned. He closed his eyes. For just a moment, he could almost hear her voice again. Not accusing, not disappointed, simply laughing. You finally listened. His eyes opened slowly. No, he whispered. I finally met someone who helped me hear you. By midsummer, the building neared completion. Fresh paint covered every wall. Bookshelves waited for donations. Woodworking benches stood ready. Computer labs buzzed with newly installed equipment. Outside, volunteers planted gardens designed by neighborhood children. Every Friday, the number of volunteers seemed to grow. Retired teachers, college students, parents, local carpenters, artists. Nobody received a salary. Everyone believed they were helping build something that mattered. One Saturday, Clara arrived early carrying a cardboard box. Inside were dozens of colored pencils, rulers, sketch pads, and erasers. Nathaniel happened to see her unloading them. I thought we already ordered supplies? We did. Then what's this? She smiled. My own contribution. He looked inside. You bought all of these yourself. They weren't expensive. You shouldn't have. She gently closed the box. I wanted the first child who walks through these doors to know someone was already expecting them. Nathaniel felt his throat tighten. He remembered Olivia saying nearly the same thing decades earlier. Buildings should welcome people before anyone speaks. That evening, after everyone had left, Nathaniel walked slowly through the completed studio. Every room reflected Olivia's vision. Yet every detail carried Clara's quiet influence. Lower windows, comfortable benches, warm reading corners, accessible workstations, gardens filled with native flowers. Nothing looked extravagant. Everything felt intentional. He paused before the entrance plaque. Until now, it remained covered by protective paper. Tomorrow, it would finally be revealed. Nathaniel carefully lifted one corner. The bronze inscription read, Olivia Brooks, Community Design Studio creating places where everyone belongs. Below, in much smaller letters, another line had been added. Inspired by the vision of Olivia Brooks and the quiet courage of Clara Warren. Nathaniel had approved the wording weeks earlier without telling Clara. He smiled. Some recognition did not need applause. It simply needed truth. As sunset bathed the building in warm golden light, neighborhood children stopped outside the fence, peering curiously through the gates. When does it open? One little girl called. Nathaniel looked toward Clara. She smiled. Very soon, Neither of them realized that the greatest transformation still had nothing to do with the building itself. It had already happened inside the people who had created it. The opening day arrived beneath a clear September sky. For the first time in months, the gardens surrounding the Olivia Brooks Community Design Studio were filled not with construction workers, but with families. Children raced between flower beds. Parents lingered near the entrance, uncertain whether they truly belonged inside such a beautiful building. Volunteers welcomed everyone with warm smiles rather than registration forms. No one was asked how much they earned. No one was asked where they lived. The front doors simply remained open. Nathaniel stood quietly near the back of the gathering, instead of on the stage prepared for the ceremony. He wore his usual charcoal suit, but there was nothing formal about the way he greeted guests. He shook hands, helped an elderly woman navigate the entrance ramp, picked up a little boy's dropped backpack before the child even noticed. Eleanor watched him with quiet amusement. "You've changed." Nathaniel smiled. "I hope so." She glanced toward the growing crowd. Miss Olivia would be proud. He looked at the building. I think she'd ask why it took me so long. Near the entrance, Clara adjusted a basket filled with sketchbooks and colored pencils. Every child who entered would receive one. No speeches first, no paperwork. The first gift they encountered would be an invitation to create. A small girl, perhaps 7 years old, approached the basket cautiously. "Are these really free?" Clara knelt to meet her eyes. "They're already yours." The girl looked toward her mother for permission before hugging the sketchbook tightly against her chest. "I've never had one that's brand new," Clara smiled. "I hope you fill every page." The child nodded so enthusiastically that several loose braids bounced across her shoulders. Moments later, Ethan arrived, wearing a volunteer badge around his neck. Instead of attending as Clara's son, he had insisted on helping throughout the day. "Where do you need me?" Clara handed him another box of supplies. "The art classroom." He grinned. "Already my favorite room." Inside the main hall, reporters quietly arranged cameras. Nathaniel had not invited the press. Word of the unusual project had spread on its own. One journalist approached him before the ceremony began. "Mr. Brooks, is this your newest philanthropic initiative?" Nathaniel shook his head. "No. It is my sister's unfinished promise." The reporter looked confused. "But the funding came from you." "The funding did. The idea didn't." Without another word, Nathaniel excused himself. He had no interest in becoming the story. Shortly before noon, everyone gathered inside the central workshop. The room looked exactly as Olivia had once imagined. Large windows flooded the space with natural light. Work tables could be rearranged for children, adults, or families. Every chair, every shelf, every pathway reflected careful thought. Not luxury. Welcome. Nathaniel stepped onto the small stage only because everyone insisted. He looked across hundreds of faces: students, teachers, neighbors, construction workers, hotel employees, architects, housekeepers, volunteers. For a long moment he simply stood there. Then he spoke. "When my younger sister dreamed about this place, I told her the numbers didn't make sense." A gentle ripple of laughter moved through the audience. "I believed successful buildings were measured by occupancy." He paused. "She believed they were measured by opportunity." His eyes found Clara standing quietly near the side wall. "For many years I thought I had preserved her dream. I was wrong. I had only preserved my regret." The room fell silent. It took someone with extraordinary humility to remind me that memories are not honored by locking doors. He turned toward Clara. "They are honored by opening them." The audience followed his gaze. Clara looked almost uncomfortable receiving so much attention. Nathaniel continued. "This building exists because two women separated by more than 20 years believed the same simple truth." He smiled. Every room should help someone breathe easier." The audience applauded warmly. Nathaniel stepped away from the podium much sooner than anyone expected. Instead of returning to his seat, he walked directly toward Clara. In front of everyone, he handed her the old brass key. She looked down in surprise. "I can't accept this." "You already have." He gently closed her fingers around it. "For decades, this key reminded me of everything I had lost." His voice remained calm. "Today, it reminds me of everything that can still grow." Several guests quietly wiped tears from their eyes. The gesture required no further explanation. The ceremony ended not with fireworks or ribbon cutting, but with children rushing toward the classrooms. Within minutes, the building came alive. Paintbrushes scraped against paper. Woodworking tools hummed under careful supervision. Parents shared coffee in the community kitchen. Grandparents settled into comfortable reading corners. Exactly as Clara had imagined, the benches near the entrance quickly filled with people waiting for family members while enjoying conversation instead of standing alone. Late that afternoon, Leonard Pierce wandered through the building carrying a notebook. He found Clara watching a group of teenagers sketching by the windows. "You notice something?" he asked. She smiled. "They're already moving the furniture." He laughed. "Doesn't that bother you?" She shook her head. "No. It means they feel like it belongs to them." Leonard closed his notebook. Then the design succeeded. Across the room, Nathaniel quietly observed the same scene. Nobody treated the building like a museum. Children leaned over tables. Parents rearranged chairs. Artists pinned drawings onto community walls. The space welcomed change instead of resisting it. He suddenly remembered the studio inside the mansion. For 23 years he had feared anyone touching it. Now he understood. A room filled with love should invite life, not silence. That evening, after the final visitors left, Nathaniel and Clara returned to Brooks' estate together. The mansion felt unusually peaceful after the excitement of the day. Without discussing it, they both walked toward the eastern corridor. Nathaniel unlocked Olivia's studio one more time. Golden sunset filtered through the familiar windows. Everything remained exactly as it had that snowy morning months earlier. Only now the room no longer felt unfinished. Nathaniel placed a framed photograph on the drafting table. It showed the grand opening earlier that afternoon. Children laughing, families creating, the studio alive. He positioned the photograph beside Olivia's original notebook. Clara noticed something written beneath the picture. The next chapter. She looked toward Nathaniel. He smiled. "I think she'd approve." "I think so too." Before leaving, Clara glanced once more around the room. Nothing here had truly been lost. Not Olivia's kindness, not her vision, not even Clara's own forgotten dream. They had simply waited for the right moment to find one another. As they switched off the lights and quietly closed the studio door, neither of them realized someone had remained behind at the community center. The little 7-year-old girl who had received the first sketchbook sat beneath a reading lamp, carefully drawing the building exactly as she remembered it. In the lower corner of the page, she printed 4 simple words with painstaking concentration. "My future starts here." 6 months passed more quickly than anyone expected. Winter had returned to Chicago once again, but this time the city looked different to Clara. Every Friday evening, lights glowed from the tall windows of the Olivia Brooks Community Design Studio. Children still filled the art rooms. Teenagers gathered around drafting tables. Parents attended evening workshops after finishing long workdays. Grandparents drank coffee in the community kitchen while waiting for grandchildren to finish classes. The building never seemed empty. It had become exactly what Olivia had hoped for. One snowy afternoon, Clara stood quietly outside the entrance after the last class ended. She watched students leave carrying rolled drawings, handmade models, and sketchbooks tucked proudly beneath their arms. A teenage boy paused beside her. "Miss Warren." She smiled. "Yes, I got accepted into an architecture program." Her eyes widened. That's wonderful. He nodded excitedly. I never thought someone like me could do this. He looked back at the building. Until this place opened. Before Clara could answer, the young man hurried across the street toward his waiting mother. She stood silently for several moments. She remembered saying nearly the same words about herself years earlier. Someone like me. How many dreams had been buried beneath those 4 words inside the studio? Nathaniel was reviewing the year's community reports. He smiled at the numbers, though for once they were not financial. More than 1,200 neighborhood residents had attended workshops. 300 children had completed introductory design courses. Dozens of adults had earned certifications leading to better employment. Scholarship partnerships with local colleges continued expanding, but one page caught his attention more than all the others. Visitor comments. The first note read, "This building makes us feel welcome before anyone says hello." Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly. Olivia had succeeded, not because she had lived to see the building, because the values she planted had survived her. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Eleanor entered carrying a small envelope. "This arrived for you." There wasn't a return address. Nathaniel opened it carefully. Inside was a child's drawing. The picture showed the community studio beneath a bright blue sky. Near the front entrance stood 2 women. One held a brass key, the other carried a sketchbook. At the bottom, written in careful handwriting, appeared a short sentence. "Thank you for building a place where my mom smiles again." Nathaniel stared at the drawing for a long time, then quietly placed it beside Olivia's photograph. Late that evening, he drove back to Brooks' estate. The mansion looked peaceful beneath freshly fallen snow. He walked instinctively towards the eastern wing. The old brass key no longer rested in his pocket. Months earlier, he had insisted Clara keep it. Now the studio remained unlocked during the day. Only at night did Clara carefully lock the door before leaving. She said every building deserved rest. Nathaniel smiled whenever he remembered that. Inside the studio, everything remained beautifully familiar. Olivia's drafting table, the framed photograph from opening day, the original notebook. And now dozens of letters from students covered one section of the inspiration board. Dreams continued replacing grief. He stood before the window overlooking the snowy gardens. "I think we finally did it," he whispered. The room answered only with quiet winter light. The following morning, Brooks' estate prepared for its annual holiday gathering. Unlike previous years, the event looked very different. Instead of hosting only executives and wealthy business partners, Nathaniel had invited every employee. Housekeepers, gardeners, maintenance workers, kitchen staff, security officers, their families, children, grandparents. The ballroom filled with laughter rarely heard within its walls. Margaret approached Clara carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "I've been meaning to tell you something." "What is it?" "I almost retired last spring." Clara looked surprised. "I didn't know. I was tired." Margaret smiled around the crowded room. "But watching everything that's happened," she shook her head gently, "it reminded me why caring for places matters." She raised her mug slightly. "So thank you." Clara laughed softly. "I learned from you." Margaret smiled. "Maybe. But now we're all learning from you." Across the ballroom, Ethan stood beside Nathaniel, examining a display of student artwork collected from the community studio. One charcoal sketch showed a family gathered around a kitchen table. Another depicted neighbors planting flowers together. None portrayed expensive buildings. Every drawing centered on people. Nathaniel noticed Ethan studying them carefully. "What do you think?" Ethan smiled. "I think Mom was right." "About what?" "Design isn't really about buildings." Nathaniel nodded. "No, it never was." Later in the evening, the mansion orchestra quietly began playing holiday music. Families danced. Children chased one another through the ballroom under careful supervision. The mansion no longer felt distant from ordinary life. It felt inhabited, warm, alive, exactly as Clara had once described. Near the fireplace, Nathaniel asked Clara to join him. He handed her a neatly wrapped package. "You didn't have to buy me anything." "I didn't." She looked confused before carefully opening it. Inside rested a simple wooden frame. Within it was the very first sketch Clara had ever drawn for Olivia's unfinished school. Beneath the drawing, a small brass plaque had been added. "Every room should help someone breathe easier. Designed with courage, completed with kindness." She looked up, speechless. "I thought it belonged somewhere you could see every day." Tears filled her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you." Nathaniel smiled gently. "You already have." She carefully held the framed sketch against her chest. Around them, conversations continued. Children laughed. Music played. Snow drifted softly beyond the tall windows. Nathaniel realized something unexpected. The mansion sounded remarkably similar to the community studio. People belonged here now, not because the architecture had changed, because the heart inside it had. As the evening drew to a close, Clara stepped outside onto the front terrace for a moment of quiet. Fresh snow covered the gardens. The cold air carried the familiar scent of pine. Nathaniel joined her a few minutes later. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, he looked toward the stars. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if that snowstorm hadn't stranded you here?" Clara smiled. "I've thought about it. And I think I would still be cleaning houses." Nathaniel laughed softly. "I think I'd still be locking doors." They stood together in comfortable silence. Then Clara reached into her coat pocket. She removed the old brass key. "I've carried this every day." Nathaniel looked at it fondly. "It suits you." She gently placed it in his hand. "I think it's time." He frowned. "It belongs to the studio. It belongs to the future." She closed his fingers around it. "Someone else will need it one day." Nathaniel understood. The key had never truly belonged to either of them. It belonged to every person brave enough to open a door that fear had kept closed. 5 years later, the first snow of December drifted gently across Chicago. The Olivia Brooks Community Design Studio had long since become an ordinary part of the neighborhood. That was perhaps its greatest success. People no longer spoke about it as a remarkable charity project. They simply called it the studio. Children said they were going there after school. Parents arranged to meet there after work. Teachers borrowed classrooms for evening programs. Artists displayed community exhibitions in the central hall. It belonged to everyone. On one particular Friday morning, Clara unlocked the front doors just as she had done thousands of times before. Although Nathaniel had officially appointed her executive director years earlier, she insisted on arriving first. She still enjoyed switching on the lights one room at a time, opening curtains, straightening chairs, checking that fresh pencils filled every container. Old habits remained comforting. As she placed a vase of winter branches on the reception desk, she noticed a young woman waiting outside, perhaps 20 years old, nervous, holding a worn portfolio beneath one arm. Clara opened the door with a welcoming smile. "Good morning." The young woman hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm in the right place." "You probably are." "I heard people here help students." "We try." The young woman looked around the bright entrance. "My family can't afford architecture school." "I almost didn't come." Clara recognized the expression immediately. She had once worn the same mixture of hope and fear. "What is your name?" "Maya." "Would you like some coffee, Maya?" The young woman nodded gratefully. Half an hour later, they sat together inside the community kitchen. Maya slowly opened her portfolio. Sketch after sketch revealed remarkable imagination. Not perfect technique, not polished presentations, just honest talent. Clara smiled as she turned the pages. "Who encouraged you to keep drawing?" Maya laughed softly. "No one. I just couldn't stop." Clara looked at her. "That's usually how dreams begin." She reached into her desk drawer. Inside rested the same old brass key Nathaniel had returned to the studio after their conversation years earlier. It no longer opened any locked room. The original lock had been replaced during renovations. Nathaniel had insisted they keep the key anyway. Not because of its function, because of its meaning. Clara gently placed it on the table. Maya looked puzzled. "What is this?" "A reminder." "Of what?" "That sometimes one open door changes an entire life." Later that afternoon, Nathaniel arrived carrying 2 boxes of donated books. At 72, his steps had slowed, but his smile appeared more easily than ever before. Children greeted him by name, not because they knew he was wealthy, because he always helped shelve books before reading stories aloud every Friday. He found Clara speaking with Maya near the design studio, another conversation, another uncertain dream. He smiled quietly. History had a beautiful habit of repeating itself. After Maya left with scholarship application forms tucked carefully into her portfolio, Nathaniel approached Clara. "She reminds me of someone." Clara laughed. "I was thinking exactly the same thing." He looked toward the front entrance. "Will she be all right?" "I think so." "What makes you certain?" "Someone believed in her before she believed in herself." Nathaniel nodded. "I've learnt that's usually enough to begin." That evening, the studio hosted its annual student exhibition. Every wall displayed projects created during the year. Affordable housing ideas, neighborhood playground concepts, community gardens, accessible libraries, public art installations. None of the displays focused on individual achievement. Instead, they celebrated collaboration. Near the center of the gallery stood a large timeline tracing the studio's history. At one end appeared a photograph of Olivia Brooks as a young design student. Beside it rested a picture of the old abandoned warehouse before renovation. Further along hung images of volunteers painting walls, construction crews installing windows, neighborhood children planting flowers, and the grand opening ceremony years earlier. At the very end of the timeline, one empty frame remained. Visitors often asked why. Beneath it, a simple sign explained, "The next chapter belongs to someone we haven't met yet." Children loved that empty frame. Many stood before it imagining themselves someday becoming part of the story. During the exhibition, Ethan arrived carrying exciting news. Now a successful civil engineer, he had just accepted a position leading affordable housing projects throughout Illinois. He hugged his mother tightly. "I wanted you to hear it first." Clara beamed with pride. "Your father would be so proud." "I hope so." "He would." Nathaniel joined them. "You know, your mother once told me homes reveal people." Ethan smiled. "She still says that." Nathaniel laughed. "I'm glad." As the evening drew to a close, Eleanor, now retired, but still visiting frequently, slowly walked through the building. She paused before the timeline, then looked toward Clara and Nathaniel talking with students. "You finally finished it," she whispered. "Not the building. The promise." Outside, snow continued falling softly. Families lingered long after the exhibition officially ended. Nobody seemed eager to leave. Children built small snowmen beside the gardens. Parents shared warm cider. Neighbors exchanged holiday greetings. The studio had become more than a school. It had become a home. Near closing time, Nathaniel and Clara walked once more through the quiet halls after everyone departed. The classrooms rested peacefully. Sketchbooks lay neatly stacked. Half-finished models waited for tomorrow. Life would begin again in the morning. Nathaniel stopped beneath Olivia's portrait. "I used to think success meant leaving behind buildings." He smiled gently. Now I think success means leaving behind people who continue building after you're gone." Clara looked around the studio. "That's what Olivia did." "And you?" She shook her head. "I only opened one door." Nathaniel looked warmly at her. "Sometimes that's all the world needs." Before locking the entrance, Clara reached into the reception desk drawer. She picked up the old brass key one last time that evening. The metal had become smooth from years of careful handling. She placed it inside a small glass display near the entrance. Below it rested a single engraved sentence: "One act of trust can unlock countless futures." She switched off the lights. Together, they stepped outside into the falling snow. Behind them, the building stood warm and bright against the winter night, welcoming tomorrow's dreamers. Years earlier, a billionaire had handed a poor maid the keys to his mansion for one night, believing he was offering shelter from a storm. Neither of them could have imagined that the room she chose would unlock far more than a forgotten memory. It would unlock forgiveness, purpose, opportunity, and a future where countless strangers would discover that the greatest doors in life are never opened by wealth alone. They are opened by compassion, courage, and the quiet decision to see people before possessions. Every life holds doors that seem permanently locked. Sometimes those doors are closed by grief, poverty, disappointment, or years of believing we are not enough. Yet this story reminds us that the greatest transformations rarely begin with extraordinary talent or endless wealth. They begin when one person chooses to see another with dignity. Nathaniel believed he was handing Clara a key to a mansion for one night, but in truth he was placing trust into the hands of someone the world had overlooked. Clara never chased luxury or recognition. She chose the room that everyone else avoided because she understood that healing matters more than comfort, purpose matters more than prestige, and people matter more than possessions. Her quiet courage awakened a forgotten dream, while Nathaniel's willingness to let go of regret turned a room filled with memories into a future filled with hope. In the end, neither of them rescued the other alone. Compassion became a bridge that allowed two broken dreams to become one lasting legacy. Never underestimate a simple act of kindness, a sincere conversation, or an opportunity offered to someone who has been ignored. You may never know how many lives can change because you decided to open one door instead of walking past it. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. What lesson stayed with you the most, and which moment moved you to tears? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy inspiring stories about kindness, hope, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next heartfelt journey together. Thank you for watching, and remember,